How you doing, sir? Thanks for joining me today.
Doing well. No, thanks for having me.
Hey, we got a lot to talk about. We were talking just a few minutes ago about the EU AI Act, and there was an update. So this is
Yeah,
more than timely and relevant given what's happening in the world. So before
yeah,
we jump into that, just a brief introduction, who you are and why
sure.
this is such a passion point for you.
Yeah. So, I'm one of the co-founders and the president of Humanize, which is a workplace analytics company that spun off my research back at MIT around trying to use data about how people interact and collaborate at work, and really to understand not at individual levels, but at really macro levels. How does work happen? How does that change over time? And how does that relate to outcomes we care about, like performance, retention, what have you? And so, obviously, to the extent that you know the work that I've done and our platform uses AI because it does. I personally don't like talking about it that much because I think there's so much hype in the space. I think it obscures what the systems actually do. Um, but I've had for a long time. There's been a certain way, both in my research and then in my company, that we've dealt, with data and analytics in a way that we thought was, ethical and scientifically correct. But obviously, with everything, regulation tends to lag that. And I've always thought that, this whole space should be regulated because obviously I think there's a lot of potential for, people analytics broadly to have a very positive impact on companies, on individuals. But again, as I think all of us know at this point, there are many potentials for harms. There's many companies doing both, I'd say, scientifically and ethically questionable things in the space. And so, I've been, excited to see, the EU try to take a, first stab at this. And so I've been following this for a while. Still not a lawyer, but I've read, read this act through a number of times. And again, I'm just interested in seeing how that's going to progress. And, where it's now sort of, very much taking shape. So I hopefully have, somewhat informed opinions on what it means, you know, for the space as a whole.
Well, yeah, again, thanks for doing this because this got to my attention you've done recently, and you took the time to actually read the act, comment on it, invite others to comment on it.
Yeah.
And before we get into the details, as an overview, what is to you, and why is it something that we in the U.S. need to be paying attention
Yeah.
to?
Well, so the act is a horizontal regulation for AI. So it's contrasted with like sectoral regulation, where you say, okay, we're going to have a regulation for AI in employment and a regulation for AI in healthcare. This one doesn't do that. I tend to like the sectoral approach, longer discussion. That's what we tend to do in the US. At the same time, there are, of course, some similarities, in terms of how the technology is deployed and developed across those sectors. So again, I understand why they did it this way, happen to disagree, but it is what it is. Um, the reason it matters in the US is that, um, again, and people have seen this with the GDPR as well. Europe not only tends to lead when it comes to regulation in tech, but also due to a number of factors, one of which being compliance costs. The regulations that they deploy in the EU, it's typically called like the Brussels effect, like things like GDPR, end up applying much more globally. And so, especially to the extent that you have multinational companies, that operate in the EU and around the world and want to use, technology globally, right, rather than, regionally, then this is going to be very important. And to the extent that you're a company that, for example, sells to the EU, like I do, and probably, lots of folks here do, then that's also something you need to be aware of because obviously you'll have to comply with it.
Well, the idea that we have to, uh, as developers of AI tools, need to obviously pay attention to how it's being used by our customers, namely enterprises. And that is going to invite the question around liability
Yeah.
and the costs of doing things that are improper. And one of the things I just want to call out up front, because the fines are steep, like steep, steep,
Yes.
steep.
Yes.
And it's also the case with AI, ChatGPT, and how it's going to be rendered in the future. There's going to be mistakes. There needs to be room for experimentation. So, what are your thoughts right out of the gate? The need for
Yeah.
regulation, but also the need to experiment and grow and find out, how AI can be used for virtuous purposes.
Yeah. So even though this thing is called, for example, the AI Act, I would honestly call it the Algorithms Act because, first of all, defining AI is basically impossible with a single definition. And for my reading, and I think most folks' reading of the Act, even with some of the updated language that I was able to take a quick read over this morning, um, things like me just based on my opinion setting down rules, right? Saying like, that would still qualify under this, which I think is correct, just to be clear. And again, I guess what I'd say is that there's a lot of very basic steps that whether you're developing an algorithm internally, whether you're developing software, that like you should do, right? That makes, these algorithms less prone to bias. You're able to detect those things, that you don't do, horribly stupid things. So I do actually think that some regulation is certainly necessary. And even for the people analytics space specifically, I still think that this act is a net positive. It doesn't do everything that I would like it to do. Um, I think there are some sort of forced errors that could be easily fixed that wouldn't actually change what they're trying to do. But reasonable people can disagree on some of these things. And so, like, I'm okay with that. To your point, violations are steep, for this, which I don't think is crazy. But I do think part of that, again, does push things like people analytics for a whole variety of reasons, which we can talk about, out of companies in the EU. And again, if you're a global company, I think it does that more broadly because this act, this isn't just if you, I think a lot of people have the misconception that this act just applies for companies that are selling or publicly deploying algorithms, which is not true. It's just about putting into use is one you could put in the market or put into use, which means if I develop some algorithm internally to, for example, like rank potential candidates who are applying for a job, that applies under this. That is a high risk application, any way you slice it, under this act. And so you will have to, again, there's a number of things that if you're a high risk application, and essentially what the act does at a high level is depending on what you're doing, classifies applications into high risk, or there's a couple other risk levels. But basically, if you're high risk, you have to register with the EU. You have to certify that you're doing certain things. You have to provide documentation. There's actually a whole bunch of things you got to do. And the EU estimates a cost of compliance at around 200,000 euros. I think it's super underestimating it, actually, for like, it's a longer discussion because of certain things actually in the latest draft that they just released this morning about, when you're training an algorithm, you actually have to provide the EU under this act, if it's high risk, with access to the training data, the test data, the algorithm itself. There's lots of things there, which I understand why they're doing it, but from a security perspective, from a people perspective, like actually making that possible is challenging,
Mhm.
right? And so from that perspective, like if I'm a company, I'm like, wow, I could spend, millions of dollars certifying this just for myself, or I could probably pay way less than that to a third party to do this, to go through, they'll still have to go through those steps, but because they can do that across companies, it ends up being a lot cheaper. And so I think that's what it's going to do. What, again, it doesn't really allow, it allows for some experimentation, but not in the market, right?
Mm.
So this is one very critical thing. They have these sandboxes, these regulatory sandboxes that they set up. And what that essentially means is they're going to have like example data that you can, deploy an algorithm on, and then you get to work with regulators to see like, does it comply with the law or not? And the great thing, at least in the new version of the act, is it appears that like, if the regulators, if you're in the sandbox and the regulators say this is okay, then you can take that as approval for this and you can register, even if you're a high risk system. Problems with that. So first, the problem is that, again, they're not going to have all kinds of data. It's not going to be for all applications. So that's a challenge. It's a 3-month, they say in the current act, it'll be 3 months, that if you apply, they have to respond in 3 months. If you get in, they're supposed to prioritize startups at the same time. And again, I understand they're a government agency. 3 months is like probably reasonable. At the same time, if you're a startup and you're waiting 3 months and you can't do anything, like that's a problem.
Mhm.
Right. And so I assume that for, startups that are developing what they classify as a high risk application, they'll probably by and large move to the US, deploy here first, and then once they get big enough, move there. I don't think that's what they want to do. I think that they should have a like these regulations should kick in once you're at a certain scale, revenue or number of people affected, something like that. That's what I would prefer. That's not what they're going with. So it is what it is. But I think if they did that, then they wouldn't probably kill a lot of startups in this space in the EU. If you're developing a non-high risk system, like what we do at Humanize under the current act, we can talk more about it, is not going to be high risk. So you could still do that in the EU, right? And I think that's good. But I would have done it a different way, which I'm not an MP, so I don't have a choice in the matter. But that's where it is.
Well, let's focus on that. I have 3 questions that are emerging out of what you said, but let's
Yep.
focus on that last point. What would you have done differently based on your reading thus far?
So there's a couple things. So I think that first of all, I would have called it the Algorithms Act because I think that they just super conflated lots of things, and I think that was just unnecessary. I think one of the big concerns about algorithms in general is the possibility that they lock in and amplify bias, and there's tons of work on that. What One way that recently has been proposed to address this in a lot of applications is actually incorporating, for example, demographic data into algorithms, because, for example, things that are predictive in one population might not be predictive in another population, right? Now, this particular technique, though, it's unclear from, again, I'll have to read over the new draft, but from at least the initial draft, it's really unclear if that would be okay, which I think is a problem, right? Because again, that's, the only way to do this. The other thing that, again, I really want to see the updated language, although I didn't see anything in it on a first glance, it changed my perception of this. I think the way that they've approached bias reduction is fundamentally wrong. What they've said is that, okay, if you're developing an algorithm and it's high risk, then you have to test for bias, and there's a bunch of things. Which, again, that's good. I'm not saying like that should happen. The issue is that what was reported, and again, I really got to dig into it, but what I'm assuming it actually says in the final draft is that the data you collect to detect bias and test for it has to be deleted after you test for it. But the thing is that this is a continuous process, right? Like
Mhm.
it even allows for, so the way there was some nice updates in the current draft that says, like, again, systems that do learn and update on their own, as long as you sort of disclose up front that they will do that, and here's like the bounds by which they will update, unless you detect a significant change and that's open to interpretation, right? Which is a little dangerous, but okay, then you don't have to recertify it. But again, if it's learning over time, the idea that, like, oh, it may have not been biased towards group X at the beginning, but then it might be. But if you don't have that data, you won't know that. Beyond that, even if you certify it for bias at the beginning, like, you should always keep raising the bar, right? So the idea that, like, let's say at first
Mhm.
I say, well, the most salient bias in this algorithm is between men and women, so I'm going to test for that bias. Fine. Okay, well, what about race? Okay, well, then again, you could pick one. You could say, all right, well, then I'm also going to check race. Okay, but what about intersectional groups? What about, migrants? What about, there's all these things, and it never ends. Like, it's infinite, right? And so the fact that you have to delete this data, and then there's this whole process by which to, like, I think that is fundamentally wrong.
Mhm.
Again, I do think it's a complex thing, but I think this is very much the wrong way to do it and doesn't get at the goals that they want to have. Um,
And let me jump
yep,
in there because I had the great pleasure of talking with your colleague, Tomasz Chamorro-Music yesterday.
yeah,
And we touched on this topic and we talked about or explored the notion of bias itself. And is there ever going to be a bias-free algorithm? Is any human being free of bias? Is any group in totality free of bias? And essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, don't attribute this to him, I'll own this, is
sure,
that no,
yeah,
there is. And so
yeah,
then it invites the question, to what degree of bias is
yes.
acceptable?
No, no,
Um,
and this is the question, right? It's like, which is hard because with people we don't have to do that, right? But here we have to make a choice.
mhm,
What level of bias is acceptable? And that,
mhm.
I mean, it sounds really bad, right?
It
Because
does.
but again, this is why I think of it as a continuous process, right? It's like
Mhm,
it'll be at a certain level and you always want to keep reducing it, but you will never be able to fully reduce it. Part of it, not just because people are biased, it's that some bias is actually impossible to statistically detect, right?
mhm,
So an easy example, right? Well, easy example, like just an example. All right. Imagine your algorithm, you have a hiring algorithm, let's say, and imagine it is biased against 30 to 35-year-old indigenous women who have PhDs from MIT in cognitive science. There might be one person who's like that,
Mhm.
right? You will never know. Like just the numbers aren't there. It's impossible to know if it's biased or not. Like literally impossible, right? And so that can never be extinguished through computational means. It cannot, right? And so we know this, right? And so I still do think what is great, and again, what I like about these systems is you can, first of all, you can quantify that. You can say, here's how biased it is. Your point. What is an acceptable level? How should it improve over time? Um, Again, I do think this is necessary because right now, certain, certain folks who don't test for this stuff, like that is really bad. And this means you have to test for it. So I do think, again, that this act will stop a lot of less like really stupid, frankly, practices of people like lazily rolling things out, not really caring about the impact. So I do think this will stop that. So again, I still think it's good, but like, why do things in this way that they said, right? I have some hypotheses about why that happened, but things like that, things like banning emotion recognition in the workplace in general. Again, I understand why you do it at the individual level. I understand that. But the fact that at an aggregate level, you can't say, like, what is the sentiment across the whole company? You actually can't do that now. Just to
Right.
be, well, not now. As soon as this gets implemented, things like sentiment analysis, you can't do under this, like, period. And so I think that an aggregate level, it gives you certain tools that you can't get through surveys. It's continuous. There's a lot of things. Again, I have my beef with it. It's not something we do to humanize. I got some beef with how people deploy it. But again, I think that at an aggregate level, classifying it as just banned is over the line. So I would definitely do that differently as well. But that's what's happening, and so that is, I think, it's interesting. It certainly has very impactful for people in analytics. I think I don't. Yeah, that's going to be hard for a lot of folks in that space. That's going to be hard.
Well, let's
Yeah,
let's talk about that. And yeah, I want to pick up as the segue to the notion of social listening and the impact of that, because those solutions have been created to guard against bias,
yeah,
to
yeah,
protect employee well-being and
yep,
psychological safety and a variety of other things. And it might, this act, as I'm hearing you talk
yeah,
about it, might actually inhibit positive outcomes that AI could
yes,
generate. So
yeah,
can you speak to that, and specifically how it's going to impact not only people analytics teams, but the
yeah,
decision around selecting appropriate technologies?
yeah. I mean, again, I think that all, my guess, and obviously these are all guesses at this point, right? Like my guess is that this will probably marginally improve, bias detection in people, developing systems in general. And I say marginally. I don't think it'll do, mostly because I think people who already care about this stuff, we're already doing it. And so like we just codify it fine. Again, I actually think it might make it, for at least what we've done up to now, it may make it harder. So it may actually make it worse. Um, because part of the things is you can maybe argue, okay, we could do some things in the US about keeping demographic data to keep trying to test for different types of biases. Thing is, US population, for example, is not the population of Europe. So we don't like, we'll have to develop new tools to do that. But again, I think they'll be very suboptimal.
Mhm.
Um, Again, reasonable people I think can disagree on that. I think that is incorrect. I do think that, again, it's really the bad actor. I don't even want to say bad actors. Like, yeah, sure, bad actors, but also like lazy actors. Like I think this, if you're just lazily like rolling things out, like you can't do that anymore. Which I think, again, I think that's correct, and
Right.
a, I think that's a very good thing, right? Um, again, I think that um, what it means though is that if internally, right, or even working with providers, like there's going to be the question of, in terms of compliance costs, do you want to? So first of all, if you want, do you want to do this internally? In which case, you're going to have to go through this process, and that's going to be expensive. And again, I think if you're big enough, it might still be worth it. Um, if you're contracting out to a third party, you still have some liability under this, just to be clear. So just because like you bought software from some provider, or even like you have a consultant come in and they're doing it and they're certified, you are still responsible, which I think is also correct, right? Because you
Mhm.
shouldn't just be able to say, oh, like the algorithm did it, which you've probably seen. There are some cases in the U.S. where like I think people who were unionizing got fired, and the manager said, "Well, we actually weren't involved because we actually don't even know how the algorithm that fires people work." And like that shouldn't happen, right?
Yeah.
Like that shouldn't happen. And so, okay, right? Like shouldn't do that. But if you're I do think there is going to be this question, right? Like are for some of these applications that are considered high risk, but again, like you said, things like we know hiring is biased, we know promotions are biased, and you know, these tools have the potential to reduce that. Do they eliminate it? No, they do not. If they're done in the wrong way, can they exacerbate it? Absolutely, which is why this is necessary. However, you worry that some companies will see this and they'll be like, wow, we violate this. It's, like something like 6%, I think, 6% of your global turnover, or 20 million bucks, whichever is higher, or 20 million euros, whichever is higher, something like that. I have to look at the updated fines. But if this isn't your business, that's a lot, right? Like
Right.
this is for you to use something internally. And so, there's, of course, lawyers always say like you always do the least risky thing, which normally they assume that means like don't do anything, which would mean don't do this. So I do think, but again, to the extent that then people, you're certified under this, I think there is what is nice about this is that there's still a lot of uncertainty in the people analytics space now about what you should and shouldn't do. And presumably, a provider being able to, or even an internal team being able to say, we've been certified by this, we go through this, that should give, I actually think that will give people like a lot more confidence, like being able to say, for example, in healthcare, that you're like a HIPAA compliant tool, that
Mhm.
that helps. Like that does help. And so I do think that that's good. I do think that there is some uncertainty in certain aspects of this act, um, which might, I don't want to say defeat the purpose from that perspective, but might make it harder. So longer discussion on that, which we can get into. But I do think there are some things that will probably be cleaned up because again, this is an EU wide act, and then what has to happen is each country has to implement like their like actual version of this that enacts all of this stuff. So I do think it will become more clear. And so hopefully it clears up some of those things that I think still create uncertainty. If you're, a company is going to use this technology again, either by developing it yourself or buying it.
Yeah. So, just to back up to go forward, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, if you have a different understanding, is that just
Mhm.
today the updated version came out of the EU
Yeah.
Commission. I mean, just
Yes.
literally
Literally this morning.
today.
It was literally like 8 hours ago or something. Yeah.
And it's supposed to be signed, ratified by the end of this calendar year, and then there's going to be a 2-year
Yeah.
grace period
Yeah.
for compliance. And not only is it going to have repercussions in the EU, but it's going to have repercussions
Yes.
globally because it's going to affect everyone who does business
Yeah.
in the EU. So, with that in mind, what do you specifically think it's going to do to people analytics as a discipline, and more specifically, people analytics teams?
So I think that again, like you said, there's some time to implementation. But what I do think this will do is probably pretty significantly. My guess is it'll pretty significantly increase the outsourcing of people analytics in the vast majority of companies. Um, it will, so from that perspective, you'll probably have, a bunch of the big consultancies that it will have way bigger people analytics practices than they do today. I mean, like very significant, right?
Mhm.
I don't think my guess is that it might slightly increase demand in this space from beyond what we see today because of the certainty that can be provided here. And this is more what I've like subjectively seen. And obviously, I'm sure other people have other opinions on it. But right now you get skittish lawyers like, is this okay? Is this not okay? And again, I think that this will make it so there will be more overall, economic activity in this space. Um, I think that, companies that this is going to, I think I mentioned it, like startups who are developing high risk things, like they will not be in the EU. Like
Mhm.
all of them will be in pretty much the US, right? Um, it will probably concentrate for the high risk applications. If you're a technology provider, again, I'm assuming the big providers will own the space. I think for non high risk stuff like what Humanize does, that's a lot less clear. I don't think it moves it that much, except maybe makes it easier for us to do business in terms of being able to say definitively, like, because what happens is when you say you're not a high risk system, it so all this is self-certified, which I sort of like, but like there's challenges with it for a whole variety of reasons. But what happens when, even if you think you're not a high risk system, like you still are supposed to submit something to, to the EU, to the regulators. And so like we'll do that, for example. And then you actually, like, they review it and they can like and them saying like, yeah, it looks like what you're doing um is not high risk. That is something that we can't hold and I can't hold in front of customers today. And so being able to do that and say like, look, here's this thing, like that is a good thing, I think. And so I do think that certainty will make certain things harder. I do wonder if companies about the high risk applications will be so skittish that they just won't engage in them at all,
Mhm.
which I think for people analytics would be a mistake. But I think that it's plausible that that happens, and then that obviously would have pretty significant ramifications. Because does that mean they just do things in other jurisdictions? I don't know about that. Like probably not. Like I don't know. So we'll see.
Yeah, we will see, and that's my concern is
Yes.
that the
Yes.
risk comes too high and the work doesn't get done.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
people I know going back 20 years, if not further, was about better understanding the
Yes.
human experience at work, and they're more often than not there's a virtuous, noble driver behind that
Yeah.
to understand engagement and inclusion and a variety of things that will benefit individuals as well as the organization. So I would hate for us to take a step back in that
Yes.
regard. I got a couple more questions, and if you're viewing or listening, by all means, ask your questions of Ben. The idea, and you alluded to it earlier, of third parties being involved. We have these providers such as Humanize servicing enterprises, and they're the customers if your products
Yep.
and services. And then there's these third parties emerging like Holistic AI, Fairnow.ai, where
Mhm.
they're effectively auditing the algorithms. And I believe, like you stated, that there's a role, but that doesn't absolve
Yeah.
either
So
the supplier or the enterprise from liability. Can you speak
yeah,
to
so the
that?
one
The
important thing
role of those
here
third
is
parties?
that it actually the act explicitly states, and I'll have to see what the final act says, but I don't think it changed. Third party auditing doesn't count under this act. Like saying that, you know, one of those companies you mentioned, or Deloitte or Accenture, or someone like they evaluated our thing, they audited it, and they said it's okay, and then you submit those. Like that actually doesn't count. You have to do it yourself. So I think eventually that should like I think it should change eventually. I do understand like the fact that most algorithms people develop, like there's a lot of subtlety in how they're developed and how they need to be tested, and knowing where the holes are. Unless you're developing it, unless you're on the development team, it's very hard to know like where would this fail. So I understand that. um I think that that doesn't negate the need for third party auditors. They can certainly be helpful in terms of, showing you where those holes are, but ultimately, like, you're still going to have to do stuff yourself. So I think that's interesting. I don't like, I imagine that'll change over time to be allow for certain things, but that's not what it is currently. And I imagine for, at least the first couple of years, that will remain the case. Um, right. Which again becomes interesting. Like, does that mean that those companies go out of business? Does it mean that, because people just have to do that internally because they're still on the hook for it? It's possible. Again, I think that would be really unfortunate, but that seems possible, at least under my reading of it. Yeah.
And when you say you have to do it internally, are you talking about buyers, the providers themselves, and the enterprises?
Everybody, so there's two things. So if you're selling a system, but again, there's two things. So there's no distinction here between you like developing and selling a system and you just developing it and deploying it internally. Like it's the same,
Mhm.
right? You still have all the exact same obligations. The one thing that's different is if you like buy a system, right? So let's say I'm just some company and I buy a system from company X that screens resumes, let's say, right? Um, you still have some responsibility here. You have some liability. First, it's to check so first it's like if it's a high risk thing, you need to check like, is it actually certified? And if it's not, and you still use it, like you are on the hook for that 100%, right? So you have to check for these things. The other thing though is that you're still on the hook. Like if you, depending on how you use it, if you use it incorrectly, if you use it in ways that it's not supposed to be used, and then that becomes high risk, you're on the hook for that 100%. So what it says here, and again, this was in the latest version, so I've got to look through it a lot more because the first version was pretty hazy. It said like you have some responsibility. It didn't exactly say what you have to submit. It looks like the latest act is a little bit more definitive about sort of users having to submit certain things. It didn't seem onerous from a first glance. It's like a one-page description of stuff. So I don't think it's like crazy. I think it's actually like probably correct. But like, you've got to say you're doing something. So again, I think that's like, if you're not thinking about it, like you probably shouldn't be using this stuff anyway. And so this, again, I think ensures like you're at least putting some thought into like, how should you use this system, right? So I don't think that kills anything beyond like people who are just, again, to the extent that people were like buying people analytics systems because they didn't want to do their job, then they won't do that anymore. But like, I'm hopeful that I don't think that's where the value in the space is. So, yeah.
Well, a couple more questions from me.
Sure.
And the idea that we're at this place in 2023, ChatGPT, generative AI,
Yeah.
large language models, and obviously the pace of innovation is mind-boggling right now. Even for us who have been around innovation, it's like this is
Mhm.
something that's different. In other words, we don't know where we're going to go. And
Yeah.
I am seeing energy around the hopefulness of what is forthcoming and also this daunting, oh, damn,
Yeah.
So, I would hate to see a retreating from where we have been. So my
Yeah.
pointed question to you, if you're advising CHRO, head of talent, and what did I say? If, I mean, when you do this, and
Yeah.
you were just in
I've
front
got a
of,
call this afternoon where I'm
yeah,
sure this will
and
come
you were
up. So
just in
we'll
front
see.
of,
Yeah. Yeah.
the United Nations in that green marble hall.
That's, yeah,
So
that was pretty cool. Yeah. Yeah.
amazing. So
Yeah.
what do you share? I mean, what's your points that you would advocate? How to move forward?
So again, I think that a lot of this codifies the way that I think people analytics management more broadly, should be done. And sort of to your point, I think that this space is still worth the investment, even for, high risk tools. I do think that, companies should seriously, will have to seriously ask at this point, though, is it, should you invest more in building partnerships with external firms? And I don't just mean, software, that could also be like consultants, things like that, because, um, again, like you're still going to have to go through all these steps if you do things internally. What I worry about there is that a lot of I think eventually advanced applications in this space probably need a lot of customization things internally, which just can't be done with like you need some people internally, but it's still going to be high risk,
Hmm.
right? I don't think we're there yet, but sort of to your point, you can sort of see that sort of stuff coming. And um, again, in the latest act, to your point, they jammed a lot of stuff about large language models in there. It looks pretty haphazard, but they're high risk under this, which I think is actually correct. So there's a longer discussion on that. But I they do say they're going to update the regulations over time, which I like. But again, I think this is why I would have preferred a sectoral approach, right?
Hmm.
Because I think that what large language models mean in employment is very different than they mean on social media. It's very different what it means in health, right? And so again, I'm worried about that. And so again, what I would just what I'm telling folks already is, again, there's still a lot of great things that can be done in the space. I think this makes doing the probably more important stuff easier, in my opinion. But I do, I think there's going to be less startups in this space over time because just the barrier to entry gets higher. And again, it sort of sucks because like this is good for like my company specifically. Like this is good, but I don't think it's good for this space. So like that's a problem, I think. Yeah.
Right. Hey, our good friend Ian O'Keefe has a question, and I'll let you. Can you read it all right, or should I read
Yeah,
it?
I can see it. All right,
Yeah,
oh hey, Ian, he's asking questions. All right, so for so folks can see it. Um, if
I'll
you're
read it to you.
buying a system, so you're again, and this is more in the latest version, so I've really got to dig into it more. But what I will do I will commit. This is going to take me longer than last time, but probably in the next week or so, I'll probably post my markup of it so people can read over it. And at least then, because I think this version's 144 pages, at least you'll be able to like zoom in on here's the parts that are relevant for people analytics. What my bet is that it appears that people analytics teams, you're not going to be on the hook at first for the predictive validity or bias. Like that's going to be something you will be on the hook for, validating that like, hey, this actually like this is registered with the EU and they said it doesn't have these things. You are on the hook if you notice something, then you have to report it, right? So like it right now it seems like you just need to be like aware of what's going on. Don't be totally hands off, but at the same time, it appears you don't have to be auditing it like every day to see if it works, right? You need some auditing ability, right? Which ideally, what it does say is ideally the provider gives you those tools and allows you to have access to logs. So actually, it says there are things in here that like you are supposed to have access to that sort of data as a user, or like either you or the provider has to have access to that and be checking to see if those things emerge. But you will be sort of on the hook for that, even if you buy it externally. But it's going to be less than you'll have to do a lot less than if you develop it yourself. If you develop yourself, you have to go through this whole certification process. Whereas if you're buying it, you just have to submit, like, again, a one pager about how you're using it, basically. And then if you detect something, let the EU know. Otherwise, you don't have to do anything. So it is like the barrier is a lot lower, right, than if you develop it.
Yeah, thanks
Yeah.
for that response. And Ian, I'll just call out that what Guru Sethupathi is doing at fairnow.ai actually provides an ongoing measurement of the risk and bias. And I imagine other providers will do this too.
Yeah.
It just invites the question, who's doing what? And that's one of the questions I have for you as we start to wrap, Ben,
Yeah.
is the governance. So historically, and even the selection of these tools in the first place.
Yeah.
So, we're not lawyers, but, we're obviously crossing
Playing
over
ones on
multiple
TV.
times.
Yeah.
There's
There we
law.
go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Case law in this right
Yeah.
now. So we kind of don't know what we don't know, yet we're trying to do what's right. And so my pointed question, going back to if you're advising, or when you advise
Yeah.
rather, leadership teams, who is involved not only in the selection process? I imagine it's IT, HR, legal, but who is involved in the ongoing governance and compliance of
Yeah.
that solution or ecosystem of solutions? Your
Yeah.
thoughts there?
So I do think that I do think there's a possibility, for example, that while for a lot of these tools right now, at least I can speak specifically about Humanize, right? Like the selection team for our software is typically pretty large, right? Which takes a lot of time. And I think one possibility with this is that it will make actually that a lot smaller, because being able to say, all right, this is, this is registered with the EU, this passes their checks, whatever, that will mean, okay, I know it's okay. I don't have to go through quite as many checks. So I do think you'll need less of those folks. I do think, and this, I'm just actually, sort of thinking about this right now, but maybe in terms of the ongoing governance of, specifically people analytics systems, maybe that is, a bigger part of what the internal team would do. Like rather than develop them, it's more like, again, checking for bias, other things like that. And that would be sort of periodic auditing of those different, technologies would probably be, something that they can do, again, because you're going to need access to, internal data to do that. Well, all those things. So I do think that's interesting. Beyond that, like, where does that sit in the organization? I mean, I think that's what, companies are going to, figure that out. I have opinions on where that should sit. Again, I do think that, that should sit, with people analytics, wherever that is. Right. But, companies get their own ideas, and we'll see where it goes.
All right. Well, hey, Ben, as we wrap up, how can people learn more about you and what you're doing? Because you're one of the few who are actually eyeballs on this actual document, thinking about it, commenting on it. And, for me, I super appreciate the work that you're doing. I actually looked at some of your comments in the last iteration, and I'm like, man, this is not, just a casual brush over. You're actually getting
No, I
into
did.
the
I
weeds
had
of
to
it.
edit the comments though. I definitely had a not safe for work version that then I had to to correct to smooth over a little bit, because I got fired up about some of the things in there. But yeah, no, I mean, people can feel free. I'm, on LinkedIn. There it is. People on Mastodon. I'm at bwaber at hci.social. And yeah, we got our site at Humanize, which is humanized with, see, look, the logo's right up there. There we go. Look at that.
That's
And
right.
it popped up. So yeah,
You
feel free
got
to
it.
look at that stuff. Um, and yeah, I should have, you know, posts about this stuff. I've got, pieces coming out in HBR in the coming weeks on this and other topics. So yeah, feel free to read and comment on those things as well.
All right, Ben, again, super appreciate you sharing. You be well, and look forward to talking again soon.
All right, absolutely.
All
Thanks.
right.